The transport vessel Meridian's Edge shuddered as it descended through the atmosphere of Kepler 442b, its hull groaning under the weight of its unusual cargo. In the ship's detention bay, Captain Marcus Chen sat in reinforced restraints, his military uniform torn and stained from 3 days of captivity. Across from him, separated by an energy barrier, crouched something that defied every xenobiological briefing he'd ever received. The creature was roughly humanoid, but stood no taller than a child. Its skin, a shifting pattern of deep purples and blues that seemed to pulse with its breathing. Forearms moved with fluid grace, each ending in delicate, six-fingered hands. Most striking were its eyes, multifaceted like a dragonfly's, but somehow conveying an intelligence that made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected recognition. "You are the human soldier," the creature said, its voice a melodic whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The translation device embedded in the ship's walls rendered the alien's words into perfect English. Though Marcus suspected something was lost in the conversion, Marcus straightened, drawing upon years of military training. "Captain Marcus Chen, United Earth Defense Force, serial number—" "I know who you are," the creature interrupted gently. "I am Zarathal of the Singing Stones clan, though I suspect your people have given my kind a different name, the Wraiths. That's what Command called them. The enemy that had appeared 3 years ago, their ships materializing from some unknown region of space to challenge humanity's expansion into the outer colonies. Marcus had fought them on 6 different worlds, had seen good soldiers fall too. Their advanced technology and seemingly supernatural abilities— "Why are we both prisoners?" Marcus asked, noting the similar restraints binding his cellmate. Zarethal's head tilted in what might have been curiosity. "The hegemony considers us both problematic. You, because you showed mercy to my people during the Battle of Proxima Station. Me, because I questioned the wisdom of this war." Marcus remembered that day vividly. His unit had cornered a group of Wraith civilians in a collapsed building. Standard protocol demanded their capture for interrogation, but Marcus had seen something. In their eyes, the same fear he'd witnessed in human refugees. He'd let them escape, filing a report about structural collapse that prevented pursuit. "You were watching," Marcus realized. "My cousin's family. You saved them." Zarothal's voice carried a note of something that transcended species gratitude. "The hegemony learned of your kindness. They see it as weakness to exploit. They see my admiration for it as betrayal." The ship lurched again, and through the small porthole, Marcus glimpsed their destination, a massive space station that looked more like a floating city than a military installation. The hegemony's primary research facility, according to intelligence reports, where enemies of the state were sent to be broken down and rebuilt. "What do they want from us?" Marcus asked. Zarathal's multifaceted eyes seemed to dim. They wished to understand human compassion, to weaponize it. They believe that by studying our connection, they can create soldiers who appear merciful, but serve only their interests. "And you? What do you want?" For a long moment, the alien was silent. Then, with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, Zarathal pressed all 4 hands against the energy barrier. The field flickered, and Marcus felt a strange warmth wash over him, not physical heat, but something deeper, more fundamental. "I want to understand why a warrior would choose mercy over victory," Zarathal whispered. "And perhaps to learn if 2 beings from different worlds can find common ground in the space between war and peace." As the Meridian's Edge docked with the station, Marcus realized that his greatest battle wasn't behind him. It was just beginning. But for the first time since his capture, he didn't feel alone. The hegemony's research facility sprawled across 17 levels, each one dedicated to a different aspect of psychological and biological experimentation. Dr. Vextar, the station's chief researcher, observed his newest subjects through a wall of reinforced transparent aluminum. His species, the Kethmori, had evolved beyond the need for what other races called emotions, making them ideal for objective scientific inquiry. "Fascinating," Vextar murmured to his assistant, a nervous young Kethmori named Yildan. "Observe. How the human stress hormones spike when the Zephyrian shows distress despite their inability to communicate directly. In the observation chamber below, Marcus paced the confines of his cell while Zarathel remained motionless in meditation. The energy barrier between them had been modified to allow limited physical contact, a calculated decision to encourage bonding that could later be analyzed and replicated. Subject 7741 human demonstrates classic pack bonding behavior, Vexstar dictated to his recording device. Despite evolutionary programming that should identify Subject 7742 Zephyrian as a threat, the human shows protective instincts. We must determine the mechanism behind this anomaly. What Vexstar couldn't measure, however, was the conversation happening in the space between words. Over the past week, Marcus and Zarathal had developed a form of communication that transcended language. A touch of fingers through the barrier's gaps, a particular rhythm of breathing, the angle of a glance which carried meaning that the monitoring systems couldn't decode. They're planning something Zarathal had communicated through a series of subtle gestures during their morning meal. The patterns in the facility's energy grid have changed, more power flowing to the lower levels. Marcus had responded by tapping out a military code against the floor, one that Zarathal had quickly learned to interpret. Escape route mapped, guard rotation memorized, need diversion. But escape wasn't their only concern. Through careful observation, it realized that dozens of other beings were held throughout the facility, representatives of species from across the galaxy, all selected for their capacity for what the hegemony termed irrational emotional responses. The hegemony believes emotion is a weakness, Zarathel had explained during one of their whispered conversations. They seek to understand it only to eliminate it from their enemies and exploit it in their allies. Marcus had grown to understand that Zaruthala's people, the Zephyrians, experienced emotions as colors and music, literally seeing feelings as shifting patterns of light and hearing them as complex harmonies. The hegemony's sterile environment was slowly driving Zarathal into a state of sensory deprivation that Marcus recognized as psychological torture. "Tell me about the singing stones," Marcus had requested one evening, watching his companions. Colors fade to muted grays. Zarathel's eyes had brightened slightly. "On my world, we grow crystals that resonate with our emotions. When my people gather, the stones sing our feelings back to us, creating harmonies that connect our hearts across vast distances. It is how we know we are not alone." "You're not alone now," Marcus had replied, pressing his palm against the barrier where Zarothal's hand waited. Dr. Vexstar noticed the gesture through his monitors and made another note. Subjects continue to exhibit bonding behavior despite species barriers. Recommend advancing to Phase 2 of experimentation. Phase 2, as Marcus and Zarathal soon discovered, involves separation. They were moved to different sections of the facility, their only contact now limited to brief glimpses during transport to various testing chambers. The hegemony's scientists subjected them to scenarios designed to break their connection, showing each one false images of the other's suffering, creating artificial conflicts through manipulated translations, even attempting to condition them to associate each other with pain. But something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening their bond, the separation strengthened it. Marcus found himself thinking not just of escape, but of protecting every being in the facility. Zarathel, meanwhile, began to understand that the human concept of hope was something that could be shared, multiplied, and transformed into action. "They don't understand," Zarathal managed to communicate during a brief moment when their transport pods crossed paths. "They think connection makes us weak, but it makes us stronger than they can imagine." Marcus nodded, his eyes reflecting a determination that had been forged in the crucible of their shared captivity. "Then let's show them what strength really looks like." 3 weeks into their separation, Marcus began to notice changes in the facility's other prisoners. During his daily transport to the testing chambers, he caught glimpses of beings from a dozen different species, each one showing signs of the same psychological manipulation he and Zarathel were enduring. But something else was happening. Something the hegemony scientists hadn't anticipated. The prisoners were communicating. It started with a Centaurian named Kexalum. whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. During a brief moment when their paths crossed in a corridor, Kexalum had flashed a sequence of lights that Marcus somehow understood meant friend. The universal translator hadn't been needed. The meaning had been clear in the rhythm and intensity of the display. Later, Marcus learned that Zerothal had been teaching other prisoners the gestural language they developed. A vegan crystal singer named Harmony had modified her vocalizations to carry messages through the facility's ventilation system. Even the Andromedan hive mind fragment, isolated from its collective, had found ways to share fragments of consciousness with willing recipients. Dr. Vextar was baffled by the development. The subjects are exhibiting unprecedented cooperative behavior, he reported to his superiors. Their individual psychological profiles suggested they would turn on each other under stress, yet they appear to be forming some sort of ... network. What Vextar couldn't comprehend was that the prisoners weren't just sharing information, they were sharing hope. Marcus had begun teaching military strategy to anyone who would listen, not through words but through demonstrated principles. When guards attempted to pit prisoners against each other in fabricated conflicts, Marcus would take the punishment meant for others, showing through action that strength could be protective rather than destructive. Zarathel, meanwhile, had discovered that her ability to see emotions as colors extended beyond her own species. She could perceive the fear that the hegemony scientists tried to hide, the doubt that crept into their certainty, and most importantly, the growing unease among the facility's guards, many of whom belonged to species that had been conquered. Rather than allied with the hegemony, the Kethmori believed they have eliminated emotion from their society. Zarathal had managed to communicate to Marcus during a brief medical examination where they were in the same room. Feel everything we do. They're just not allowed to acknowledge it. This revelation sparked a new phase of their resistance. Instead of focusing solely on escape, Marcus and Zerothal began to reach out to their captors. Marcus would thank guards who showed even minor kindnesses, acknowledging their personhood in ways that clearly made them uncomfortable. Zarathal would allow her emotional colors to shift in response to the guards' hidden feelings, creating a visual representation of emotions they'd been taught to suppress. The effect was subtle but profound. Guard rotations became less rigid as individuals began to linger during prisoner interactions. Security protocols were followed less strictly. Most tellingly, the facility's emotional dampening fields designed to suppress the prisoner's capacity for hope and connection began to experience mysterious malfunctions. Sir Yildan reported nervously to Dr. Vextar, "The dampening fields in sectors 7 through 12 are showing irregular patterns. It's as if they're being ... influenced ... by some external force." Vextar's analysis revealed the truth. The prisoners weren't just resisting the emotional suppression, they were actively countering it. Zarathel's ability to perceive and project emotions, combined with Marcus's unwavering determination to protect others, had created a feedback loop that was spreading throughout the facility. "Impossible," Vextar muttered, reviewing the data. "Emotional resonance cannot overcome technological suppression. The mathematics don't support it." But the mathematics had never accounted for the human concept of love, not romantic love, but the fierce, protective love that extends to all beings capable of suffering. Marcus had found that his connection with Zarathal had awakened something in him that transcended species boundaries. Every prisoner in the facility had become someone worth protecting, someone whose freedom mattered as much as his own. Similarly, Zarathel's understanding of human compassion had evolved beyond intellectual curiosity. It wasn't just an emotion, it was a choice, one that could be made again and again, even in the darkest circumstances. "They're planning something," Yildan observed, watching the monitors that showed increased activity among the prisoners. "Should we initiate lockdown protocols?" Vextar considered this, then made a decision that would have been impossible for him just weeks earlier.
No.
"Let's see what they're truly capable of. For science, of course." But as he spoke, Vextar assistant noticed something the chief researcher hadn't. A flicker of what almost looked like curiosity in Vextar's eyes. The emotional resonance was spreading further than anyone had realized. The breakthrough came during what the hegemony called empathy testing, a series of experiments designed to measure and manipulate the emotional responses of their subjects. Dr. Vextar designed a scenario where prisoners would be forced to choose between their own welfare and that of strangers, expecting to document the breakdown of their altruistic behaviors under extreme stress. Instead, he witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about consciousness itself. Marcus had been placed in a chamber where he could see, but not reach, a dozen other prisoners from various species. Each was connected to a device that would deliver increasingly painful neural stimulation. Marcus was given a simple choice. He could stop the pain for one individual by accepting twice the intensity himself, or he could remain passive and watch them suffer. The human will initially attempt to save them all, Vextar predicted to his observation team. But as the pain increases, survival instincts will override altruistic impulses. We'll document the exact threshold where compassion becomes self-preservation. Marcus's response shattered those predictions. Not only did he immediately begin accepting the pain meant for others, but he started talking to them not through the facility's translation system, but in the gestural language he and Zarathal had developed. More remarkably, the other prisoners began responding, and something unprecedented happened. The pain sharing became voluntary and distributed. Instead of one individual bearing the full burden, the entire group began to share it equally. Neural stimulation devices, designed to target individual nervous systems, couldn't adapt to this collective response. The prisoners had essentially hacked the system through cooperation. Possible, Vextar whispered, watching his instruments register readings that defied the known laws of neurology. They're creating a shared pain processing network. The technology doesn't exist too, sir, Yildan interrupted, his voice carrying an unusual tremor. The human is looking directly at the observation window. Marcus stood in the center of the chamber, his body clearly racked with shared pain, but his eyes were steady and focused. When he spoke, his voice carried through the facility's communication system with a clarity that suggested he'd figured out how to override the audio dampeners. Dr. Vextar, Marcus said, I know you're watching. I know you think you're studying weakness. But you're witnessing something your people have forgotten, the strength that comes from choosing to care about others, even when it costs you everything. In another section of the facility, Zarathal was undergoing her own form of testing. The hegemony scientists had created an artificial environment designed to overwhelm her synesthetic perception of emotions. Chaotic patterns of light and sound bombarded her senses, intended to break her connection to her empathic abilities instead. Zarathal began to sing. The song wasn't audible to most species, but it resonated through the facility's structure itself. Her voice found harmonics in the metal walls, the energy conduits, even the quantum fields that powered the station. As she sang, her emotional colors began to shift and flow, creating patterns that somehow reached every being in the facility. She's turning the entire station into a resonance chamber, one of the technicians reported in amazement. The structural harmonics are amplifying her empathic projections. Everyone in the facility is experiencing joy, Yildan finished, his voice filled with wonder. She's sharing the feeling of joy. For the first time in his adult life, Dr. Vextar felt an emotion that his species had supposedly evolved beyond. As Zarathal's song washed over him, he experienced something that could only be described as happiness, not the satisfaction of successful research, but the pure, uncomplicated joy of connection with another conscious being. The effect spread throughout the facility like a wave. Guards paused in their duties, their faces showing expressions that many hadn't worn since childhood. Prisoners who had been isolated for months suddenly felt the presence of others who understood their suffering. Even the facility's automated systems seemed to respond, with lights growing warmer and air circulation improving as if the station itself was breathing more freely. Sir, Yildan said, and Vextar realized his assistant was smiling. What are your orders? For a long moment, Vextar stood silent, experiencing the full weight of what he had witnessed. His scientific training told him to increase security measures to isolate the subjects before their influence spread further. But something deeper, something he had thought his people had lost forever, whispered a different response. Ildan, he said finally, I want you to run a full diagnostic on the facility's emotional dampening systems. Sir, I want to know if they can be adjusted, perhaps even disabled. Vexstar's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I believe we may have been conducting the wrong experiment entirely. Zarathal's song continued to resonate through the station. In Marcus's example inspired acts of courage throughout the facility, something remarkable was happening. The hegemony's greatest weapon, their ability to suppress its emotion and enforce cold logic, was being transformed into something else entirely. Prisoners weren't just planning an escape anymore. They were planning a revolution of the heart. The facility's transformation accelerated over the following days. Dr. Vexstar's decision to disable the emotional dampening fields had consequences that rippled far beyond his original intentions. Guards who had served the hegemony for decades began to question orders that had once seemed logical. Prisoners found themselves working together not just for survival, but for something greater, the possibility of changing their captors' hearts as well as securing their own freedom. Marcus and Zarathal, reunited when the rigid security protocols began to break down, found themselves at the center of something unprecedented. What had begun as a bond between two individuals had become a movement that transcended species boundaries. The Hegemony Council has noticed the irregularities, Zarathal informed Marcus during one of their planning sessions. Her ability to perceive emotions had evolved to include reading the quantum signatures of long-distance communications. Sending an enforcement fleet? 3 days? Perhaps 4? Marcus nodded grimly. Then we need to move faster. How many of the guards are with us? 47 have expressed willingness to help, replied Kexvalum, the Centaurian, whose bioluminescent communication had helped coordinate the resistance. But Vexstar's transformation has been the most remarkable. He's not just helping us, he's becoming one of us. Indeed, Dr. Vexstar had undergone a change that defied every assumption about his species. The return of emotional capacity hadn't driven him to madness, as Kethmori doctrine suggested it would. It had awakened a compassion that made him more effective as both a scientist and a leader. He had begun using his access to the facility's systems to help prisoners communicate with their home worlds, sending messages that the hegemony had blocked for years. The Council will not simply destroy the facility, Vexstar explained during a clandestine meeting in his laboratory. They need to understand what happened here before they can prevent it from happening elsewhere. We'll send investigators first, then make their decision. Which gives us a window, Marcus realized. If we can demonstrate that this change is beneficial rather than destructive, we might be able to negotiate. Zarathel's colors shifted to patterns that Marcus had learned indicated deep concern. The hegemony doesn't negotiate, they conquer, or they eliminate. There is no middle ground in their philosophy. Then we create a middle ground, Marcus said with a quiet certainty that had made him a natural leader. We show them something they've never seen before, the strength that comes from choosing cooperation over domination. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to escape or fight the incoming fleet, they would transform the facility into a demonstration of what their society could become. Every species represented among the prisoners would contribute their unique abilities to create something beautiful and functional, a living example of diversity as strength rather than weakness. The Andromedan hive mind fragment, no longer isolated, began to coordinate the efforts of different groups with a precision that amazed even the facility's original designers. The vegan crystal singers created harmonic fields that enhanced communication between species that had never been able to understand each other before. Centaurian bioluminescence provided a visual language that transcended traditional barriers, while Zephyrian emotional projection created an atmosphere of trust and cooperation that made complex negotiations possible. Marcus found himself serving as a bridge between military strategy and humanitarian principles. His experience in warfare had taught him about logistics, resource management, and tactical thinking. But his bond with Zarathal had shown him how to apply these skills in service of creation rather than destruction. You're becoming something new, Zarathal observed one evening as they watched the facility's transformation. Not just a human, but something that transcends species entirely. We all are, Marcus replied. That's the point. the hegemony thinks. Evolution means eliminating what makes us different. But what if it means learning to celebrate those differences while finding the connections that make us one? Dr. Vextar, monitoring their conversation through the facility's systems, found himself nodding in agreement. His scientific training had taught him to look for patterns and underlying principles. What he was witnessing wasn't chaos or emotional. Breakdown it was the emergence of a new form of civilization, one based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed order. Sir Yildan reported the enforcement fleet has dropped out of hyperspace. They're requesting permission to dock. Vextar looked around his laboratory, which had been transformed into a coordination center for the facility's new society. Representatives from a dozen species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. The air hummed with the energy of beings who had found purpose beyond mere survival. Grant them permission, Vextar said finally. But, Yildan, make sure they understand that they're not boarding a prison facility anymore. They're entering an Embassy, place where different forms of consciousness have learned to coexist and thrive. As the enforcement fleet approached, Marcus and Zarathal stood together at the facility's main observation deck, watching the ships that would determine their fate. Around them, dozens of other beings waited with a mixture of hope and determination. Whatever happens, Zarathal said, her colors shifting to the deep blues and purples that Marcus had learned indicated profound affection. We've proven that connection is stronger than isolation. Marcus took her hand, feeling the warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature and everything to do with the bond they had forged. Then let's show them what that connection can accomplish. The enforcement fleet's arrival marked the beginning of the most crucial test Marcus and Zarathal had ever faced. The lead ship, a massive hegemony dreadnought called the Absolute Order, docked with the facility under heavy security protocols. Admiral Kethfer, the hegemony's most decorated military leader, led a team of investigators and combat specialists who expected to find a facility in chaos. Its prisoners and staff driven to madness by uncontrolled emotional responses. Instead, they found something that challenged every assumption about how civilized society should function. Welcome to Research Station Omega-7. Dr. Vextar greeted them at the airlock. His demeanor calm and professional, despite the radical changes he had undergone. Though I should mention that we've recently restructured our operations to focus on collaborative research rather than isolation studies. Admiral Kethfer's expression remained impassive. But Marcus, watching from the facility's central hub, could see the subtle signs of confusion in the military. Leader's posture, the Admiral, had prepared for rebellion, breakdown, or chaos. He hadn't prepared for what appeared to be a functioning society. Dr. Vextar, the Admiral said, you will explain the irregularities in this facility's operations. Long-range sensors detected emotional resonance patterns that should be impossible given your containment protocols. With respect, Admiral, I believe a demonstration would be more effective than an explanation, Vextar replied. If you would follow me? What followed was a tour that systematically dismantled everything the hegemony believed about the relationship between emotion and efficiency. In the facility's former detention areas, the Admiral witnessed prisoners from dozens of species, working together on projects that showcased the unique capabilities of each culture. The Andromedan hive mind fragment had helped design new communication protocols that allowed real-time translation not just of words but of concepts and emotions. Centaurian bioluminescence had been integrated with vegan crystal singing to create art forms that conveyed complex scientific principles through beauty rather than abstract mathematics. This is unprecedented, Admiral Kethfer admitted as they observed a group of former prisoners teaching facility guards techniques for emotional regulation that their own species had never developed. But it proves nothing about military effectiveness or social stability. Then perhaps you should observe our response to crisis, Marcus said, stepping forward from where he had been waiting with Zarathol and the other community leaders. Yildan, please activate the emergency simulation we prepared. The facility's lights shifted to emergency status, and automated systems began announcing a catastrophic failure in the station's life support systems. According to the simulation, it less than 2 hours before atmospheric integrity would be compromised throughout the station. The Admiral and his team watched in amazement as the facility's inhabitants responded. There was no panic, no competition for resources, no breakdown of social order. Instead, individuals from every species immediately began working together with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic. The Andromedan fragment coordinated repair efforts, while Zephyrian emotional projection kept everyone calm and focused. Humans provided leadership and strategic thinking, while other species contributed their unique technological and biological capabilities. Impossible. One of the Admiral's technical specialists whispered. They're solving the crisis faster than our best emergency response teams could manage. And without a single casualty or conflict, added another observer, within 45 minutes. The simulated crisis had been resolved through a combination of technical innovation and social cooperation that impressed even the Admiral's most skeptical advisors. But the real revelation came when the simulation ended and the facility's inhabitants didn't simply return to their previous activities. Instead, they began analyzing what had happened, looking for ways to improve their response, and sharing their discoveries with the Admiral's team. You see, Zarathal explained to the Admiral, her colors shifting to patterns that conveyed patient instruction. The hegemony believes that emotion creates chaos. But what we've discovered is that emotion, properly understood and integrated, creates resilience. When beings care about each other, they become stronger together than they could ever be alone. Admiral Kethfer found himself in an unprecedented situation. His orders had been clear. Investigate the facility's irregularities. Determine if they represented a threat to hegemony stability, and take appropriate action. The evidence before him suggested that what had happened here wasn't a breakdown of order, it was an evolution toward something better. Dr. Vextar, the Admiral said finally, your reports indicated that this transformation began with the interaction between the human prisoner and the Zephyrian subject. Is this correct? It began with their connection, Vextar confirmed, but it became something much larger. What Marcus and Zarathal demonstrated was that the capacity for empathy and cooperation exists in all of us. They simply showed us how to access it. The Admiral turned to Marcus and Zarathal, studying them with the intensity of a career military officer trying to assess a potential threat. And what do you propose should happen now? The hegemony cannot simply ignore what has occurred here. Marcus and Zarathal exchanged a look that communicated volumes. Then Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a natural leader throughout this entire experience. We propose that the hegemony consider a different approach to governance, he said. Instead of ruling through fear and suppression, what if you led through inspiration and cooperation? What if the strength of your civilization came not from eliminating diversity, but from celebrating it? The galaxy is vast, Zarathal added, her emotional colors shifting to patterns that conveyed hope and possibility. There's room for many different ways of being conscious, many different approaches. To civilization, the hegemony could be the force that helps them all flourish, rather than the power that forces them to conform. Admiral Kethfer was silent for a long moment, processing implications that went far beyond his original mission parameters. Round him, his own team was clearly affected by what they had witnessed. The emotional resonance that had transformed. The facility was beginning to work on them as well. I will need to report these findings to the Council, he said finally. But I suspect that this conversation is far from over. 6 months after Admiral Kethfer's initial investigation, the former research station Omega-7 had become something unprecedented in galactic history, the first interspecies cooperation institute. Representatives from over 100 different civilizations had come to study what the media had dubbed the Omega Transformation, the proof that emotional connection and diversity could create strength rather than weakness. Marcus stood in the Institute's Central Observatory, watching as a group of young beings from a dozen different species worked together on a project that would have been impossible under the old hegemony system. They were designing a new type of Starship One that could adapt to the needs of any species while fostering communication and cooperation among diverse crews. The Council's decision was unanimous, Zarathal said, joining him at the observation window. Her colors had evolved over the months to include new patterns that Marcus had learned indicated deep contentment and hope for the future. The hegemony will officially transition to the cooperative alliance within the year. And Admiral Kethfer, Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He's requested assignment as the first director of interspecies relations. Zarathal replied with what Marcus had learned was her equivalent of a smile. Apparently, witnessing our transformation convinced him that there were better ways to serve his people than through conquest. The changes hadn't been without challenges. Some sectors of the former hegemony had resisted the transformation, requiring careful negotiation and occasionally the kind of strategic thinking that Marcus's military background had provided. But the fundamental shift had been irreversible. Once beings had experienced the strength that came from genuine cooperation, few were willing to return to the isolation and fear that had characterized the old system. Dr. Vextar, now the Institute's chief research coordinator, approached them. With a datapad containing the day's reports, the Andromedon Collective has agreed to share their consciousness-linking technology with any species that requests it. He announced, and the Centaurian Republic is establishing cultural exchange programs with 47 different civilizations. About Earth? Marcus asked. Any word from command? Your former superiors are? Adjusting, Vextar replied diplomatically. The concept of voluntary cooperation with former enemies is challenging for military minds to accept. But the results speak for themselves. Trade has increased by 300% in sectors where the new protocols have been implemented. Conflicts have decreased by over 90%. Marcus nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. The transformation he and Zarathal had catalyzed was spreading throughout the galaxy, but it required patience and demonstration rather than force. Each species, each civilization, had to choose cooperation for themselves. There's something else, Zarathal said. Her colors shifting to patterns that Marcus had learned indicated excitement mixed with nervousness. The Institute has received a request from the Outer Rim territories. They want us to help mediate a conflict between species that have been at war for over a century. Dangerous work, Marcus observed, but important. We've been asked to lead the mediation team, Zarathal continued. Both of us, together. Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature and everything to do with the bond they had forged in the depths of captivity. Over the months, their partnership had evolved into something that transcended species boundaries, a connection that demonstrated the possibility of understanding across any divide. Together, he agreed. Always together, as they prepared to leave. The observatory, Marcus paused for one last look at the young beings working on their starship design. Among them, he noticed, representatives of species that had been enemies just months before humans and Zephyrians. Centaurians and Andromedans, even reformed Kethmori who had chosen emotion over cold logic. Do you think it will last? Yes, Zarathal. This transformation we've started? Zarathal's colors shifted to the deep blues and purples that Marcus had learned indicated profound certainty. It will last because it's not imposed from above, it's chosen from within. Every being who experiences genuine connection, who discovers that caring for others makes them stronger rather than weaker, becomes a seed for further transformation. And if we encounter resistance, some civilizations refuse to change, then we'll do what we've always done, Zarathal replied, taking his hand as they walked toward their next mission. We'll show them, through our example, that there's a better way. We'll prove that the strength of the heart is greater than the power of the sword. As they boarded the transport that would take them to the Outer Rim, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had begun as enemies, prisoners of a system that saw diversity as weakness and emotion as failure. They had become something new, partners in a transformation that was reshaping the galaxy. One heart at a time, the war that had brought them together was over. The peace they were building would last forever. Carried forward by every being who chose connection over isolation, cooperation over conquest, and love over fear. Behind them, the Interspecies Cooperation Institute continued its work, a beacon of hope in a galaxy that was finally learning to celebrate the strength that came from unity in diversity, and ahead of them lay new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate that the greatest victories were won not through force, but through the courage to care for one another across any divide. The stars awaited, and Marcus and Zarathal faced. Them together, bound not by war but freed by the infinite possibilities of the heart.